Hey everyone! If you're a fan of the show, please head over to mikeyop.com and click the subscribe button. It's the best way to support us, and it's free. That's MIKEYOPP.com. Thanks!
Hi, I'm Mike Oppenheim, and you are listening to Coffin Talk, Interviews with the Living, a weekly podcast that explores how our views on death affect the way we live our life. And this week, coming to us live from Boston, Massachusetts, is a comedian, Nash Flynn. She's also a writer and a host of several podcasts, so say hello, Nash.
Hello.
And how are you doing this lovely evening?
I am good. How about you?
I'm pretty good. We usually record much earlier, but it doesn't matter. But it's always fun to do it in kind of what I call the evening. And for you, it's 8 p.m. there, right?
That's true. It is 8. The end of my day.
Yeah, I figured. But you are a comedian, and I don't know if my audience fully knows this, but comedy is my favorite thing in the whole world. There's nothing I would rather spend my time doing than supporting comedy, going to comedy shows, and loving all things comedy. So, with that said, I'm really happy to have our first comedian on the show. So do you want to tell us a little bit about the scene there, what it's like, what you're doing?
I'm not doing a lot, to be honest with you. Once the pandemic hit, I was just starting to do comedy. And so largely my exposure to comedy has been from my basement on Zoom calls. So.
Oh, yeah. I totally understand that. Although I have seen, you have a very funny Twitter account and you're a very funny person. So, yeah, but that does suck.
Oh, thank you so much.
That's definitely a problem. And you do host 2 podcasts, right?
I do. Yes, Death and Friends is my primary one because in addition to being a comedian, I'm a death historian. And my other one is Tomorrow Today, which is about academic research and trying to bring it into a more public sphere.
Very cool. That's awesome. It was so someone on Twitter told me to follow your account, and then we found it, and then I was like, oh wow, you're a death historian. That's incredible. So let's quickly segue into that. First of all, just for the average Joe who has no idea what that means, what exactly is a death historian in your definition?
So I actually studied deathways, which is an anthropological research designed to basically study a culture through how it sort of works around death, what the rituals are, what the burials look like, what the remembrance looks like. So basically looking at a culture through death as an ecosystem, as a way to sort of figure out what a culture is doing, or over time where a culture is going, especially if there's cross-cultural contact or wars or famine, sort of things that bring two cultures together and one assimilates into another one or is eradicated by another one. That's mainly where my focus is. So looking where those cultures collaborate in the very physical landscape of death. But Deathways it's not been around an enormous long time. It is an anthropological undertaking. And it is relatively new to the scene. So normally I get the same reaction every time, what the hell does that mean? So yes, your listeners would not be alone in wondering what that is.
Well, that's really cool, and I have tons of questions now to ask about that just as a discipline. I think my main first question would be, many disciplines create an index to kind of measure cultures against each other, not as in superior or less superior, but just something to kind of compare and contrast them. Is there such a thing for the way cultures deal with death?
So because Deathways is so new and it's still sort of being developed, I don't think there's a specific standard that we'd use. I actually looked at cultures in crisis. So basically what happens when your culture breaks down from a very high mortality rate, and what happens to your deathways as your culture is falling apart, and what happens in the rebuild. So my master's thesis was specifically looking at 1620 Plymouth in the States, and sort of because they had such a high mortality rate that first winter, it was about 50 to 60%, looking at what they lost and then what they started to build back after they sort of started collaborating with the nearby indigenous tribes, the Wampanoag. And, as time went on, as more people came over, how the Deathways sort of built themselves back up.
Wow. That's just, my mind is going a million miles a minute with that. It's funny because we started the show in the pre-show little sound check interview. My daughter, who's about to turn 10 months old, was screaming, and I'm often very happily shocked by how low the infant mortality rate is. And when I study anything about history, that's always the first thing that jumps out at me, and not naming kids because they were likely to die and all that. So I'm curious, would you say that America, since we have a very high, I don't want to say health index or anything, but our life expectancy is pretty high and we have a pretty good standard of living here. Is the way we deal with death similar to other cultures with this similar standards, or are we different, do you think?
I'm not sure that I could totally answer that because I focus so specifically on specific events. I will say, I think in modern times, we deal with death almost not at all in the West. After looking at history, and I actually just finished a podcast a couple days ago about the Victorian good death concept. And it's actually a really fascinating way to look at death, because the Victorians built up so much of our funerary culture and how we sort of used to deal with death. But in modern America, in the modern West, I feel like it's so sanitized now that we're actually not dealing with very physical death. It's sort of all an emotional project. And it's an emotional project that we tend to not seek out in other people. Everybody's grief is this sort of solitary thing, and we don't deal in dead bodies or people dying in front of us. So I feel like we actually don't really deal with death at all in modernity.
Yeah, wow. I mean, that's basically my presumption for starting this podcast. And after volunteering in hospice, it became very evident to me that we have a not talking about death problem, at least in my very limited perspective of hospice care, because not only are the patients not always prepared for it, but especially the families. And I think it's fascinating. And so do you think, like, right now, are you kind of like, I know it's impossible to like literally do this, but are you somewhat more than casually, like professionally eyeing like the crisis in Ukraine and the war with Russia there, and like how that mortality rate is going to affect those two cultures and what you talked about with like the linking?
I mean, modernity stuff scares me a little bit, because it's, especially in a situation like that, it's so tenuous. But I will say, I'm sure that there will be, very, very physical remnants of whatever happens in the Ukraine and with Russia. But I will say, one of the things you start to see in deathways when you're looking at times of war is this sort of war against dead bodies and wars against, like cemeteries and memorials that often become the brunt of, an invading force. They use deathways as another form of violence.
Oh, wow. That's very fascinating. Have you studied like the peculiar 1950s cultures where like the world was suddenly privy to this idea that one nation could like quote unquote blow up the whole world with nuclear arsenals, and then people were building like shelters and stuff? Have you ever looked into that?
I have depression. The modern world really scares me in a lot of ways. So I try not to participate so much in the deathways that are happening right now.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no. Yeah, that's very cool. And I admire you for not only saying that, but like explaining it that way, because yeah, that's, I'm asking from that exact kind of direction almost. Like, yeah, can you help me? Give me some stats that make me feel better, please. But yeah, no, that's cool. And I also think, while it is awesome that you're a death historian, and I did have you on in part because of that, and especially because you also host a podcast that talks about it, but I did want to hear kind of like the intersectionality between a personality that studies death and a personality that loves comedy. I personally find a huge, obvious connection between the two, but that's not my, it's not my forte to explain that, but I'm assuming you probably can. So, obviously you probably get asked that a lot, right?
I actually don't get asked that as much as you would think, but for me, it really is, I have a lot of social anxiety, if that wasn't clear. But for me, performing and studying dead people is sort of the same thing. Like, I still get the dopamine from participating in that conversation, but it's a monologue. The audience isn't really going to engage with me that much. The dead people really aren't going to engage with me that much. So for me, it's sort of exploring how I understand my own participation in the modern world via a lens where I'm not going to get a ton of feedback unless it's laughter.
That makes a lot of sense. And actually, it's funny because I've listened to a lot of podcasts, 3 different podcasts in the last 2 weeks. Kind of were talking about that famous study where they interviewed people or polled people or whatever, and they said that there's a greater tendency of a fear of speaking in public than a fear of death in itself. And that's always tossed around as a joke. So you're like literally confronting the two at the same time and kind of playing with that. So that's pretty awesome.
I was just going to say, I think it's a really fun intersection that nobody really gets to explore too much. Comedians, I think, on the whole, tend to be on the darker side of things. There's a lot of trauma that infers a lot of comedy. And for me, it was easy sort of connecting the two. I have depression. I've had suicidal ideation for many years. And so sort of being able to talk about that in a space that feels like I could be doing either thing. There's a lot of comfort in studying dead people whose whole stories, whose whole biographies are complete. And when you're sort of in an existence that feels very, very, tenuous in modern life and it can be very, scary, sort of looking back at some of those full histories and being like, this is how it started, this is how it ended, and now it's wrapped up and done, and you can infer what you'd like out of it. I think there's a real comfort in that for me.
Yeah, totally. And, you've mentioned it twice now, and you've opened up about depression and suicide and all that. And that's stuff that I care deeply about, and it's come up quite a few times on the show. So first of all, thank you. And second of all, do you think that by speaking about it and talking about it and opening up about it, and that more and more people are doing that now, do you think that's like helping us as a society? Because it's kind of tangentially related to my we don't talk about death or anything. Like I also think we don't talk about suicide, which is I understand the reasons why. I understand that I now have to put a warning on this podcast, and I will. But are you following what I'm trying to ask?
Yeah, no. I do agree with you. I think I mean I do hope talking about it helps other people. I'm not sure that my approach necessarily works for everyone, but I like talking about it in part because I feel like even in comedy, we talk about depression, we talk about anxiety, but there's not a lot of comics that actually talk about suicidal ideation as a very specific topic. I've had it basically since the moment I could sort of self-actualize, and it's something that I even mentioned to my parents when I was young, and they sort of brushed it off, and they were like, "You'll be fine." We did lose a family member to suicide, and we also never talked about that. So to your point too, I think we have a tendency to be like, "Okay, don't do it because it's really selfish," when in actuality, it's not selfish at all. We've been trying for so long to get anybody to listen that it becomes sort of this very topic that nobody really wants to deal with or grapple with, and everybody tries to make you feel like it's your fault.
Wow, that's deep and profound. And like I said, I'm a huge fan of comedy, so obviously I've had many comics that I admire and like who've killed themselves, and it's shocking when it happens, and it's also the least shocking thing ever.
Right.
And I think it's a wonderful, noble idea to like put yourself out there and try to make people laugh. But I also think it's a wonderful, noble idea to put yourself out there and say like, sometimes for reasons I can't explain to myself or out loud to anyone, I'm deeply, deeply depressed. And, and I'm trying with this podcast to kind of get people to think about all of these things. So is there, since you've had that since childhood and since you've grown up with that feeling, do you see life as like a test of you against that?
I did for a long time. I did for a really long time. But one of the things that happened to me when the pandemic is obviously all of my depression got worse, pretty much like everybody else. And one of the conclusions that I really came to in this weird sort of exploration catharsis was that I actually find it a really, really powerful thought that I could take my own life at any moment. It feels sort of like taking back the urge and the thought and making it something that I can use. And I feel like that's really helped me a lot in thinking like, well, I could not be here any moment, but I keep doing it because I've decided to. And that sort of, phrasing of it, that sort of understanding of it helps me not want to as much.
That's really cool. I really appreciate that answer. Wow. We're kind of like halfway through the interview, so I want to ask you the pivotal question that we ask all our guests. And I think you've done a great job of explaining who you are and how you've come to the way you think in your pathology. So thank you. And so the question you should know it already is just, what do you think is going to happen when you die? And the only thing I like to make sure that the guest understands is I'm really asking you about like your vivid imaginary like version to yourself. So it's not important if you think it's realistic or not. Just what do you think is going to happen to you?
Honestly, I don't actually think about what happens after a whole lot because I'm so focused, especially historically, on what's happening as you die. In Death and Friends, we talk a lot about, that moment of death when we declare somebody's dead, when how death actually occurs from a specific thing. So I actually haven't spent an enormous amount of time thinking about what happens after, but I did. When you asked me to come on, I did listen to a couple of the previous interviews, and so I knew that you were going to ask me this question, and I started really thinking about it. And I think my whole answer hinges on, I have a very vivid imagination, but I can't apply it here. And I honestly really wish I could. I wish religion worked for me. I wish I could sort of apply something in the forward motion. But I think partially because my brain tends to run so dark is that I really do feel like it's a very hard stopping point and there's sort of nothing beyond that. And I mean, like biologically, chemically, I think sort of quote unquote science is sort of with me. Like we sort of just break down and become a part of our environment. And then, we feed animals, we come back as, plants. And I think there's a lot of beauty in that, but I do feel like for me, consciousness is sort of stopped and gone. And actually, excuse me, if I could just like keep on talking forever.
Please. No, this is the whole part of the show.
There was a study that just came out recently. Dr. Zemmer's group, I believe in the University of Louisiana, just released a study where they actually were in the middle of some kind of medical scan, a CT scan or an MRI, and their patient died as they were recording. He had a bunch of seizures and then he passed as they had it. So this was the first time they actually have recorded an actual person's brain death as a medical use. And it was really, really fascinating. It's that actually, like, I believe it was published by Living Science. And it's a really fascinating look in what the human brain does at death. And there is evidence, according to this team, that you actually do get a sort of life replay. Your brain activity kicks way up in the last 60 to 90 seconds. And it seems like you are getting some kind of replay, some memory recall before the brain actually dies.
Wow. And then I would further posit, out of optimism and joy at hearing that 90 seconds could feel like an eternity, because there's already on record, people who have had like 10-year-long dreams where they were like they could not get out of the dream they wanted to, and like 10 real-time years passed in that dream. And then of course they wake up and it's, been like an hour or two of sleep.
Yeah. I mean, you might get a whole nother shot at things,
Yeah. So that's crazy. And actually I did want to ask you on that note, what are like some of the more mystical experiences you've had, or like what is your opinion of like inexplicable phenomenon and like the metaphysical tales that we tell ourselves and have and all that?
In truth, I would absolutely love to have had any of experiences or like any connection to it. The closest thing I have is I had a little cousin who told his mother when he was like 2 or 3 that he remembered being in her womb, and she was like, "That's not actually possible." And then he was like, "Yeah, you loved that song that she used to play for him." It was like on a Baby Einstein video. She never played it. She only ever played it in the car, so he never heard it as a child. He'd only ever heard it when she was pregnant, and he was able to sort of replicate it. So I think that's probably as close as I get, really. I do wish ghosts were real. Honestly, I'm very, very passionate about wishing ghosts were real, just because I think that would be so entertaining. I don't know. I wish, but no.
No, and I understand that. So on that line, I kind of want to have some fun fact time with you, because you really are. You're a historian of death, and I love it. And your area of expertise is obviously the most familiar to our audience, because like America is actually becoming a country and a country during it and all that, so that it exists here. But what is your favorite morbid tale of like high mortality rates, like in some situations? So you brought up obviously 1620 and what we call the Pilgrims. What is like another example that's just like absurd, or something maybe people haven't really thought about or heard about?
So there's a story I'd love to tell. It's not a very high mortality rate. To answer the mortality rate part of your question, I will say I think in my studies, I think one of the sadder, more wide-scoping events that often gets overlooked is the Irish famine of the 1840s. In like terms of specificity, I think like 1847 was called Black 1847, and it was a widespread death in Ireland. But there is a mass grave outside of the city of Cork that is sort of just a field now, but it contains something like 40,000 bodies over the course of a year or so. That number might be a little bit inaccurate, but that's as close as I remember. And it is one of those things that the famine, we call it a famine in the current context, but really the Irish do not refer to it as a famine, because the famine implies a crop failure. And what is actually happening in Ireland at that time is sort of the British eradicating Irish culture very deliberately, with very specific governance choices happening in London that were not connected to Ireland at all. So the Irish are really indentured servants on their own land, and then starved out because the British wanted to buy it and use the resources. So in terms of mortality, that one is the bummer. But I do have a favorite story, if you'll indulge me just a little bit more.
Yes, please.
So one of my favorite historical figures, and not for any good reason whatsoever, she's a prostitute in 19th century New York. Her name is Helen Jewett. She does not live very long. She dies when she's about 26. She had a not so great upbringing. She was born in Maine. Her father was an alcoholic. Her mother died shortly after she was born. She makes her way down to Boston and to New York. She becomes a prostitute. She is murdered by a client brutally. And then later her body is dug up and donated, quote unquote, to the medical college. But one of the things that I love about Helen's story is that in the time between when she was, in New York and before she gets murdered, obviously, she has this, she's a very, very, she's good at what she does. She works for the best brothel in New York. And everybody says that she's very smart, she's beautiful. But when she gets her own money, she buys these beautiful dresses that she has made for herself, and she buys classic literature. Like, she goes out to find what people are talking about, what people are reading. And everybody says she's incredibly bright. So one of the reasons that I love Helen Jewett's story so much, not because of how she dies or how she was raised, is those days that I can sort of picture very viscerally, where she's got this money that's her own, she's got like all of this freedom, and she's, maybe walking around New York, with her book of the week or book of the day, sort of just enjoying the sunshine. And I love that because it's one of those things to me that is this very like, you have the beginning, you have the end. And then what I think history sometimes tends to lose is what happens in the middle, what happens on a day where they're just bored or they have nothing to do, because we tend to think of them as characters and they become very flat to us as historical people. So I always have this like nice little moment of like Helen like sitting in Central Park with her book in the sunshine and just enjoying it and not remembering how things started or how things are about to end for her.
That is so cool. That was a great story. Thank you. Wow.
Of course.
We are heading up to the end of the interview, so I always give my guests the last word, which is just a chance to tell the internet and the people listening what you think. I would also like to, if I can, make a special request, and by all means, you can not do it if you don't feel comfortable, but since I do love comedy, maybe just like 3 comedians you think people should check out, and they can be super, super famous. It doesn't matter, but I want my audience to get into comedy. So
for comedians that I like actually love that I will watch at any moment, Robin Williams is always my number one. He's obviously passed, and so he's hopefully watching this from the afterlife being like, yeah, I know he's not, but I can believe it. So he's my favorite. For modern comics who are working right now, I think there's almost nothing like watching Daniel Sloss do comedy. He's a Scottish comedian. He has 2 Netflix specials out now, Jigsaw and Dark, I believe is the other one. But he does also sort of this dark storytelling. And so his comedy is very, it's traumatic, but he also is weaving together a narrative, and it's not always funny. And I think that's the mark of true talent, is how long you can take a crowd attending a comedy show to, through a couple minutes of non-comedy, to build a story and then be able to bring them back into the sphere of laughter again after that. I mean, I think he's really quite brilliant. So always a fan of his.
yeah.
I think you asked me for 3, and I'm trying to think, because Daniel is so good at it. I do think in terms of other comedians, there are a bunch of friends that obviously I want to plug. Man, this is actually harder than I thought it would be, because I wanted to say everybody.
It is hard, and I thought about it before I asked you, and I was like, if someone asked me, it would be very hard. So I that's why I said if you can't do it, it's fine. So, but I like the big push to Robin Williams, because I think a lot of people think of him as like Mrs. Doubtfire in movies, and no, he's also, I mean, he's a comedian in everything he did, but yeah, and a philosopher. And then we'll definitely have to check out the second person you mentioned, who I think I've heard of but not seen, so I'm actually really excited, and I have Netflix, so obviously I'm going to check that out. But please, if you can, take us out with something you feel that you want to just express to our audience.
I think one of the things that has made palading the current world a little bit easier is the study of history. I know typically we don't apply history to our real life situations because either we're not teaching it well, or we're teaching it in these sort of bubbles. In academia, I do feel like we never even learn that things are happening at the same time. You just sort of learn them as discrete events, and then you memorize the facts and you never want to deal with it again. But I do think history can be comforting in that way, where you see sort of the beginning and the end of the narrative. You see all of the places that it's connected to, and you can kind of say, well, this makes me feel better about this. We are in sort of an unprecedented time, I think, where we're getting so much of global news happening at once, bad things everywhere all of the time, because we have a 24-hour media, and because of the internet, really, we have access to every bad thing that could possibly happen. The history is full of those bad things, and it's full of those good things too. And I think sometimes, even if it's for only the purpose of our mental health and to keep going and to stop crisis fatigue, I think sometimes we have to celebrate those little things that we can find in history or find now that help us bear the rest of it.
Wow, that was amazing. That was really, really deep and profound. I think that's the second time I've said that about something you said. So I feel like this whole interview was like that. And you're definitely, you're a national treasure. So I hope that people check you out. I said it at the beginning, but she's all over the internet, and especially Twitter. So it's Nash Flynn. And please check the bio notes and everything for the spellings and all that. But thank you again, Nash, for coming on our show and helping us put another nail in the coffin. You're truly, truly the first death historian we've had, and a true expert on all things death, and also you're funny and you're interesting, so thank you. This was a wonderful way to spend my time, so I hope you had a good time. And
thank you so much for having me.
And to our audience listening at home, please support the show by subscribing, and if you can, rate us. And lastly, head over to mikeyop.com and maybe subscribe to the weekly essay that goes along with the podcast. And either way, we appreciate you listening. We appreciate you, Nash, and we will see you soon. Walking alone.